This is the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels like they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across the table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey all, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different than those in the past. I do have another guest and friend here with me today that I will introduce here in a moment. But we are going to take some time to just sit down and have an opportunity for someone who is completely normal with regards to their relationship with alcohol, the way alcohol affects them, and who is also subsequently an incredible question asker, and give him an opportunity to just sit down and ask questions about my personal struggle with alcoholism, kind of tease out ideas, thought patterns, and behaviors that maybe haven't come out in the podcast before. But also this is kind of a selfish podcast in some regards because it is with a close friend, one whom which I haven't really had time to sit down and just talk through everything that went on in our lives leading up to the point of our friendship, during our friendship, and then after rehab, where our friendship continued, I should add, luckily. So, Zach, just want to say hello, and then I'll dive into kind of our background, and we'll get to it.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. Zach Hansen, for everybody listening. Close friends with Kyle, going on several years now. And
you moved to Boise in late 2019, right?
Late 2019, okay. Right, pre-COVID, and that's right when we first met at jiu-jitsu, but I'm sure we'll go into that. But
yep.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot to say about what we've been through. I think just as a primer, you know, what's interesting is Kyle and I have been friends across the broadest spectrum that you can think about. We started off with athletics, jiu-jitsu, formed into like family relationships between each other, our wives, and then our subsequent children. And then beyond that, we became business partners. All the while, you were an alcoholic. So I think Correct. It's a pretty interesting story to dive into.
Yeah, it really does paint a picture of how deep the entangled the lies got. And all of those things that you said. And it is really interesting looking at the progression of our lives and friendships from the standpoint of like, we met you before you met your wife, and so we got to experience you two coming together, and then both of our families started right around the same time, so that next step into being a father. And quite honestly, like as we progressed together personally, professionally, with our friendship, the rift internally between who I desired to be and who I knew I could be and who I was actually becoming really started to grow with each one of those steps. But then also having a friend like yourself and someone who is, when it comes down to it, like very capable, was just like really drawing attention to me, to the issue that I had at hand, because it's like I was able to see an example of where I could be, where I should be. And it put me in touch with like how directionally I was driving myself further and further down into a hole and through this hell that I was going through. So honestly, Zach, like you summarized basically all of the points that I wanted to get to with regards to our background. I think it is really key and important about how we not only have a personal friendship, but like our families are very well connected. Like we have grown together in a very similar pattern with regards to taking those important steps in life. And I think the only thing that I really want to add is Zach alluded to it about how we went through all of these things and experiences together, even professionally, like starting a business together. And all the while there was this hiding and lying on my end, so much so that it wasn't until we were driving to rehab on May 15th, early morning, that I texted a very few and close friends that, hey, I'm going, something along the lines of, and I should have pulled it up prior to this conversation, but it was obviously point blank, and it was just kind of like, I've been hiding this issue. It's gotten really bad. I'm going into rehab. I'm not going to have my phone, so I won't be in touch. But I think I asked you if it was all right if I was able to call you during my time in rehab, because that's really the only outbound communication that we were allowed. Luckily, like in the 15 to 20 minute drive that it took to get to rehab, you responded. And it was just like, honestly, I needed the type of response that you sent, because it was,
I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, it was, I can't tell you verbatim, but the feeling that I got was like, oh, this is okay to open up to people about this and to be honest about it, because you were incredibly graceful, accepting, and supportive. And it truly just was something like, we are always there for you. We love you. We want you to get better. And again, it was one of the last messages that I got before I turned my phone over. And under it all, I think it was a big part in like why I started to slowly gain confidence in being honest about this and like really buckling down and pursuing it, is knowing that to the few people I opened up and expressed my shortcomings to right before I stepped into the walls of rehab, I did get some return, like feedback that like, hey man, it's okay. We're here for you. So that was it. And then honestly, I think I called you once while in rehab. Once or twice.
You called me, I think 3 times.
Okay.
One I did not answer. And
That's right.
We can get into that. Into my own insecurities and fears of, working and dealing with someone who is an alcoholic. But yeah, I think it was 3 times.
Yeah.
Two maybe that I was able to answer and chat with you.
Yeah, no, that's right, because our last call was super brief. It was like 2 days before I was checking out, and I realized I needed a ride home from rehab because Alyssa was alone with Grant, and so she couldn't pull away. It was super early that I was going to be getting out of rehab, and I called you, and I was like, I'm going to be walking out the doors at 6 a.m. on June 12th, Monday, June 12th. Could you be there? And it was like, no questions asked. You were just like, yes. And sure enough, I walked out the doors. You were sitting there waiting for me. It's like you had shown up early.
We do come from a family where, early is on time, on time is late is unacceptable. So,
and that is one of the core reasons you and I are friends. But anyway, so yeah, then really where I want to jump off with this podcast and open it up to you asking questions is kind of like sort of hearkening back to that ride home from rehab. So it was a short drive, and obviously I was borderline in shock, I think. And we were having sort of surface level conversations about like, what did you do in there? Like, what how are you feeling? Sort of those types of things, what are your next steps? But obviously just in that short amount of time, we couldn't really get into the depths of like, hey, Zach, I surprised you with this. Like there's a lot more to this than just spending 28 days in this facility. And what happened next in life was, it was under 60 days later that we found out about Lucy and her health concerns, and our world turned upside down. And then obviously that shifted our friendship and support needs so much so that it's like we never really circled back and even like talked about the things that went on and were occurring in my life leading up to our friendship, and then leading up starting and then leading up to me going into rehab. So it's a very I think as I learn and grow in terms of like podcasting and putting these types of content together, it's probably a really poor way of kicking this off, but like, what questions do you have?
First and foremost, I don't think it's a bad way to kick it off. It's interesting. So to paint the picture for people, maybe in a little bit more depth, right? Kyle and I, we'd been friends for several years. And frankly, that day you called me or texted me that you were going to rehab, I don't know if you remember, but 2 days prior to that, you had called me crying. And when I got that text from you about being open, or my response was being open, like, hey, we support you, we love you. To be frank, I was glad you didn't kill yourself.
Yep.
And we can get more into depth in that. Like, I haven't dealt with that directly with friends who've been suicidal, but there was every ounce of my being that thought that I was going to get a call that you were dead.
Yeah.
So it was deeper than just that. Like, I was genuinely just glad you were alive.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. I do not remember that explicitly, but that would have been the night that our wives were together.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
That was the last night that I ever drank.
Yep. And that was a bad one from what I understand.
Yep.
But to get to your point, like on the drive home, so I showed up 5:45 in the morning. I had driven 4 hours. I came down from the cabin.
That's right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, I knew I had to be there, and I told Allie, I'm like, all right, I'm going to get Kyle. So I drove from the cabin down, got there. So I left at like 2 a.m., something like that. Got there. And, it was interesting because it felt like I was meeting you for the first time.
Yeah.
And for people who, and there's probably going to be a lot of pauses in this conversation for people because I'm trying to articulate my own thoughts too, because it is a lot to take in when you're working and going through these feelings of curiosity. And now I have the opportunity to ask these questions. But I showed up at 5:45 a.m. You walked out the door. We hugged. And I say it was like meeting you for the first time, but there were always glimpses of you. Like there was a reason you and I were friends before that.
Right.
And I had genuinely, up until the day that I thought you were going to kill yourself, no clue. And for people thinking, and we can go through the why, like Kyle is a fantastic liar.
Yep.
I mean, just to be frank, like I had zero clue that you were an alcoholic. And I can tell you what I thought about you, and we can go into that.
Yep.
But when you walked out of those doors, I was like, this is Kyle. This is the Kyle that I've always expected to show up every day. And it was nice. We got in my truck. We had that 15-minute drive. And there's a few specific things that I remember about that drive. One is I had 4 hours prior of driving down to think about it.
Yep.
I wasn't nervous. And we talked about this prior to getting on the podcast. Like I have like a terminal ability to not be anxious about things, and the ability to just kind of think about it logically. And the only things I told myself were zero judgment, let you do the talking, and just be there. Those were the three things that I talked myself into the whole drive. Because I had 100,000 questions.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And some of them are on my iPhone sitting next to me here. But when in that drive, there are a few things that I remember, and those are when we pulled out, the first things we talked about, And, Alyssa, if you're listening, I mean, yes, it was like, I miss my wife, I miss my kid for sure. But like, we were asking and talking about rehab. I'm asking like, hey, what was it like? And honestly, it was almost like a juvenile response, because I feel like you hadn't been able to tap into your own masculinity and the ability to do those things that you needed to do for so long that you had offset with alcohol. And again, this is Zach's perspective, so correct me where I am or I'm not wrong. But you were focused on the things that were like, hey, I got to go boxing every day. How awesome was that?
Right.
Or not every day, but like there were these things that you had been abstaining from for so long, or you had dabbled in, and then alcohol had gotten in the way of being able to do it, which was mindfulness, athletics, and you had 30 days or however long it was to fully dedicate yourself to your soul, your body, and your, frankly, recovery, right? That's what it's called.
No, and that actually draws focus into like a really key part and aspect, and ultimately the value of rehab. And I actually really like how I don't like it in terms of like where I was at the time, but the word choice and your perspective of it is spot on in that it is juvenile. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of recovery and those who choose to go to rehab that I talk to, because I do have conversations. People have started opening up to me in a big way, and the topic of rehab comes up often, and questions around like, do I go? What's the value of me going? What should I expect? And it's really interesting hearing that, because the juvenile aspect of it, what I continue to tell people is rehab is not going to solve your issue. It is just a start. It is truly like being reborn again. And so like, yes, you do. It's one of those things like you reflect. Sitting here now, I reflect back on where I was back then. And I had this realization recently, actually, with my wife and I having our anniversary kind of in between the time period of me getting out of rehab and us finding out about Lucy's health condition. That period of time for us was blissful, and it was innocent. And that hit me really hard when I reflected back and realized like how innocent we were a year ago. And so like coming out of rehab, I mean, truly my focus and my actions were just like so honed in on like doing the very few things that I could to right the ship. And for me, it all comes back to like the practices that I've laid out on this podcast that ultimately were the progression for me. And so like that first one for me was movement. And then, the second one was practicing gratitude, which was like doing these very tactical but small like journals and exercises and things like that. And so like, Zach, your point is like really valid, because it's like there were really my whole life for the 28 months in that whole, or the 28 days in that whole reset opportunity just caused me to focus and get excited, quite frankly, about these like kind of small, like seemingly meaningless things. But then that opportunity to sort of parse things back and focus on those small things, ultimately that was the foundation to allow me to start taking like bigger steps. And those bigger steps happened after rehab. And that's the important thing that I stress to people who are questioning things. It's like the fix doesn't occur in rehab. Setting yourself up to get yourself to the solution after rehab is like really what rehab is for.
And it's not funny. It is. I have a dark sense of
humor. There's dark humor all strung throughout this.
When you came out and we were talking, and like when I think about these things that you were excited about, and again, I had just primed myself for 4 hours to say like no judgment, no nothing, just listen, learn. And the excitement you had was awesome. Mm-hmm. It was over things that maybe I hadn't expected someone to be excited about coming out of rehab, but also like you were talking to me as if you had just graduated high school and were the valedictorian. Mm-hmm. Because you were kind of the valedictorian of your rehab class.
Yep.
You know, you were telling me about your leadership roles and like all the things and the glimpses of the Kyle I thought you were.
Right.
And that I admired before. It had like in a microcosm come out in a 30-day period where you were sober.
Right.
You had excelled at every activity they had you through. Mm-hmm. You excelled at the mental aspect, the meditation, like everything you told me. It's like you were top of class,
right? Yeah,
and you were excited to tell me you were top of class.
Yeah. Yep.
Which I was excited for you, but it was interesting because like it was this small microcosm of everything I already had come to expect out of you. Mm-hmm. That had blips in your prior life, and we can talk about those blips. Which was hidden behind a really well concocted facade, which I do want to talk about. I'm going to say a 5-minute drive, because there's another aspect to this drive, 15 minutes. And those first 5 minutes were what we're talking about now. You were telling me about your boxing classes. You know, you were like deemed the leader. You were like, you got extra privilege, you know, like all these different things that you had done.
2 desserts.
Exactly.
You could take as many desserts as you want.
But I don't know if you remember this, but then leaving the rehab facility, driving down the road, getting within probably 5 minutes of your house, we passed a gas station that you used to buy alcohol from. Do you remember what you said?
I don't remember what I said, but I distinctly remember the progression of thoughts that had gone through my head, because it was a monumental moment for me with regards to realizing that basically this is real now.
And for me, like, again, some parts are hazy. I don't think I was peppering you with questions, was I?
No, not at all.
Okay. And, you know, obviously it was nice to hear about all the things you've done for 30 days. Yep. And frankly, like, as an outsider, I'm like, shit, I wish I had 30 days to go and like focus on all these little things.
Yeah,
like,
seriously.
Honestly, like, if I'm reflecting on my own emotions, like I was a little jealous. I'm like, I've just been working for 30 days and like trying to scramble by, and like, you got to focus on all these things. That sounds awesome. It's like a vacation. Again, my own mind. But then we got to this gas station, and that's when it like turned. It not turned from a negative perspective. It wasn't like some sharp, like there's silence in the car. But you pointed out this gas station that was sitting diagonal across from us at a stoplight. And you go, I used to buy alcohol there. Mm-hmm. And I didn't ask you anything. And you started to tell me how you had gotten, I don't know if it was, maybe we don't want to talk a lot about alcohol on this thing, but you talked about like your progression to an alcohol of choice that had gotten you out of where you weren't going to be as discovered. Right. And you went and did this, and you would do it at a certain time of day often, and then go home.
Yeah. A quick note on, let's just call it the alcohol of choice. I distinctly choose not to like actually name what I drink, because in all honesty, I don't want to give the thing credit.
Good.
Like, I don't want to give the company credit. Like, it was very specific to a company and a specific type of drink, but we can talk like all day about the experimentation that I did around it. And I'll talk broadly about like IPAs did this to me, stouts did this to me, but when it comes down to it, like, I refuse to name the actual distiller, brewer, whatever that I drank from. But yeah, to your point, it was like very specific about, and that was the Maverick, right? Mm-hmm. Yep.
You know it.
Yep, absolutely.
And then I have the picture in my head, right, of that corner. And every time I drive by it now, and every time I drove by it since, I had to drive by it every day when I went to jiu-jitsu, and every day I thought about you.
Yep.
Because in that exact moment is when I realized that I had it very easy. Mm-hmm. Frankly.
Yep.
Like, I've never had a bad relationship with alcohol.
Yep.
I've pretty much been sober.
I know.
Since you went into rehab.
And that's the incredible thing, is how in the Alcoholics Anonymous book talks about it, like, normal people in their language is they take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And like, there has never been anyone in my life that I have seen with the ability to take it or leave it than you.
Yeah. I don't care.
Yes. It's crazy. And that's wild to me. It's like, I actually don't get it. I desired it at one point. I'm content and happy where I am now, but like, I just genuinely like don't get it.
Yeah. But nonetheless, like, that's when I realized in that drive home, like, there is something deeper here than just like Kyle got a 30-day vacation.
Right. Yeah.
And just to speed it up a little bit, like this, just seeing your reaction to can I cuss?
Yeah.
A fucking gas station.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I saw your demeanor change.
Yeah.
Like, you were just this guy who just came back from Cabo, suntan, buffer than you were. You lost some weight.
Yep.
You looked good. And it's like you saw a ghost. Genuinely, it's like you saw a fucking ghost driving by a gas station.
Right.
And it was in that 10 seconds and where you just started pointing it out and you started to talk and you just started to tell me, like, open up. I didn't ask questions.
Yep.
I realized in that moment, like, oh, okay, this rehab thing, like, this was not just a vacation. Like, you've been in hell and you're going to be in hell for quite a while because, like, a gas station on the corner of a road held something over you that I couldn't comprehend.
Right.
A gas station.
Yep. And for me, it was that moment. There was a build up to that because as we were driving, and the reason I know and talk about our conversation on that drive home as being kind of like surface level was I was able to be processing and thinking about things in the back of my mind because we had passed numerous gas stations on that drive. And it was only until that moment that we stopped at that Maverick on that corner that I had the time to realize. And I left rehab, and I talked about this in leaving rehab with a healthy fear of what was next. And to this day, I still, instead of it being fear, I would say I have a respect for what alcohol a respect and understanding for what alcohol will do to me. But in the days outside, in weeks and months, quite frankly, outside of rehab, there was a healthy level of fear that existed. And that stare down across the corner was like, you're 100% right. And I'm so glad to be doing this because I don't remember that distinct moment without you saying it. But yeah, it truly was like facing your demon for the first time. And for me, the thought that went through my mind was, okay, this is going to continue to exist in the world. I need to buckle down and figure out how to sustain my recovery with alcohol in the world around me. Yeah.
And there wasn't much left on that drive. It was 4 minutes. You know, we went through that. I didn't ask any more questions. I know, like, and we don't have to get into this. I'm sure you've talked about this before. Like, you were going to meet your wife and kids for the first time, and I was dropping you off. Like, there was no, like, hugs, kisses. Like,
pretty quick goodbye.
Yeah, it was like, yeah. I mean, like, we drove to your house. I dropped you off. High five. Said, give me a call when you need me. And we did that. But that was my first impressions after that. Turned right down, drove back to the cabin.
Yeah,
and
amazing.
Then, you know, you gave me leeway on this podcast. You said you want to ask questions, so I'm going to take the mic a little bit here.
Perfect.
Because I want to frame a few things. So I think that's the perfect setup. And when I met you, 2019, so this is several years prior, right? We met at jiu-jitsu. Go figure. So combative sports. Struck up a friendship because we started talking about hunting. I was in Idaho to hunt. You came to Idaho to hunt.
Yep.
You ended up buying a Traeger from me.
Yep.
And, you know, that kind of kicked off our friendship.
Yep.
And, you know,
same career paths too.
Same career paths. I'm going to do the best flyover I can of our relationship and my view of it to get to a question.
Perfect.
About what you were feeling during that time.
Yep.
And my read of you. So 2019, you do jiu-jitsu. We go to jiu-jitsu. You know, that's a hard thing to do. For anybody looking for a sport, do jiu-jitsu. Everybody's heard it everywhere. It sucks. It's hard. And I automatically have respect for anybody who's white belt or above in jiu-jitsu. It means you've stuck with it. You can do hard things. That's kind of like my almost entry level, like we can be friends.
Yep. Right.
So, you're doing that. We're doing that. We start talking. We're like, wow, we're kind of in similar spaces, same career fields, et cetera, et cetera. Let's introduce our wives. We do the meet cute and our wives hit it off. It's like, great.
Yep.
This is fantastic.
We have friends.
Yeah, we
Post
have friends.
30, we
I
made
know.
friends.
High five for us, our awkward weirdos. And it was interesting. We'd go out to eat dinner with our wives. Our wives had drink. We drank.
Mm-hmm.
I never drank more than one drink at dinner.
Yep.
That was just my thing. I was like, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have a drink with dinner and fine. And you always mimicked me.
Yep.
And I don't know if that was intentional or not. And I don't want to get into that yet. We can get to that.
Yep.
So there was this first seeding of these dates where I'm like, okay, like I never had a clue, and I'm going to say this several times in this monologue, that you had a problem with alcohol.
Right.
It's like, great. We started talking about careers. We started talking about more. Both of our wives end up getting pregnant. Mm-hmm. We go through the whole pregnancy thing, having kids, high-fiving. You and I went on several hunts together. Mm-hmm. I helped you with prepping for interviews for Capital One, which is a previous employer of mine, your current employer. All of these things that we did that were so similar, and I never knew you had a problem with alcohol. We started a company together. Mm-hmm. We went to expos together. We slept in Airbnbs together. Mm-hmm. I never knew you had a problem with alcohol, despite us drinking together.
Right.
But there was one thread through all of this, and it was, if I had to describe your personality, it's Kyle's the smartest guy I ever met, but he can be really aloof sometimes.
Yep.
And what I didn't realize, let me actually look at my phone so I know if I have the question right.
Yep.
There were moments within our relationship, in these peaks and valleys where you go to jiu-jitsu with me sometimes and you'd be like, oh, I don't feel very good.
Yep.
And you would be like half-assing a workout, or, I'd pass your guard real quick. I'm like, dude, this guy's strong. Like, what's wrong? Mm-hmm. And you would always say, I don't know if you remember this. You'd be like, there's some days I'm just off.
Yep.
Some days I'm off. And then I think you even had used the word aloof sometimes to describe yourself. And you primed it so well in these situations that I was like, Kyle can just be kind of an airhead sometimes.
Right. Right.
And it was these situations where you went up to our cabin one time and, you're up by yourself, and, my neighbor, Gene, had gone by to see you, and he called me and he was like, Kyle seems a little, the guy at your house seems a little off.
Yep.
And I'm like, Kyle, no, I trust Kyle. Don't worry about it, Gene. He's like, okay. And a guy that I trust too, our fire chief up there, called me, and I was like, Kyle's just aloof. He can be a little bit of a ditz sometimes.
Yep.
In our business, there were times where I was expecting something from you and it would fall through the cracks.
Yep.
And you had done such a good job priming the pump that I was like, Kyle's aloof.
Right.
And you always made up for it.
Right. Yep.
So there was always this follow through where you made up for the deficiencies. I'm like, Kyle's just an aloof guy.
Yep.
And then it would be the same situation across the board, to where you had convinced me that you're just aloof sometimes. Mm-hmm. And my question to you is, as somebody who has to be the smartest guy I know, on paper, on just in reality, I'm sitting in your nice ADU, you just walked me through your house where you did the electricity, you did the plumbing, and another primer, and people forgive me for this monologue, the moment I realized you were full of shit. Capital One, for all its faults, and for people listening, I worked at Capital One prior to Kyle. I was on their hiring board. I did hiring. Capital One, from a software product management perspective, is one of the tightest ships to try to get onto. Mm-hmm. The bar for hiring is so high that we throw people out left and right. So when you came to me and you were looking for a new job, and I kind of put you in touch with people at Capital One and told you it was a great company to work for, all this stuff, and frankly, I'm like,
good luck.
Good luck. Yeah, like, I'll prep you, I'll help you, I'll do whatever I can.
Totally, yeah.
And you nailed it. And like I remember, like the hiring manager, like, yeah, Kyle nailed it. I'm like, damn. Like, and that's when I knew that you weren't an aloof Kyle. Like
right.
I didn't know you were hiding something.
Yep.
But I was like, okay, this is bullshit.
Yep.
Like, either he really just needs to unwind, and like he's so smart that like sometimes he just crashes and burns.
Yep.
And like goes into somebody who's like a little bit. No, I'm not going to use that word. But people can infer whatever they want there. But it was shocking to me, and it's like, okay, this is bullshit.
Right.
Like, this guy is so smart. Like, I can't. It's hard for me to now justify these aloof moments along the way. But I still didn't say anything.
Right.
So my question to you is, as somebody who prides themselves on being smart, and I know you take pride in that.
Yep.
How hard was it to pick up this persona of somebody who's frankly dumb,
right,
to cover up this problem that you had?
Yeah, no, it was one of those, not one of those. The situation was that all of the complexities and the story and the perception that you just laid out for you as the friend in a manner that we spent a lot of time like building up and portraying, that perception, multiply that across all of my relationships, right? And all of the situations that I was in professionally, from like just basically any relationship that I had in life, multiply that out, and it's not just like an addition of another relationship. One other relationship or engagement adds such a layer of complexity to the story that where I ultimately got to was like sort of what you were saying, to put it in like non-eloquent terms. It's like this underlying story about just having stupidity and making mistakes and but always being able to make up for it. It was sort of this spot that I could revert to and bring any relationship or situation back to, so that I could figure out and manipulate, because manipulation is a huge part of my personality, my story, and being an alcoholic. It's like this easy, no excuses spot to fall back to. And then from that point, it was like I had to put every ounce of creativity and energy behind figuring out, how do I bring myself back up from that, like, oh, this was just some really stupid situation, something I did really dumb, to build it back up to like, okay, now I'm a person that Zach is now viewing again as a friend and a capable person. So it's like think about like all of my relationships strung out before you, and it's like each one had its own tangled web of lies that was the story that I was creating. And the only way that I could tie them all together was like, I do stupid things every once in a while, or I get really lazy every once in a while, or I get really hard to reach every once in a while. And it's just like, underlying all of it was inconsistency, right? Like that's been one of the biggest changes in my life since entering recovery. It's just like, holy cow, how consistent and how reliable that I can be as a friend, as a family member. But yeah, I mean, I often reflect back and think back to it just in the total tangle of lies and stories that I had going in various parts of my life. And I talked about it. One of the reasons that the end happened the way it did for me pertaining to drinking and lying about it was I started to realize that in all reality, if I was going to bring all of these stories and these various aspects of my life into one seamless merge in the future and just be able to move on with life and have this confusing period of 2, 3, 4 years of a lot of chaos in my life, that process of tying all of these lies and all of these different areas of my life together was genuinely going to be like a 3-year endeavor. And I would be lying my ass off through the entire process to get through it. And that realization of just like how much effort, how much energy I was going to have to continue putting behind the lies, continue progressing the story about like, yeah, I'm just a screw up sometimes. And like, I get lazy, I make mistakes, but then as a part of that like story that I wanted to have play out, it's like, well, I'm going to have to lessen that, like those moments of stupidity. And it's just like, it's one of those, it became a scenario for me. It's like the web had become so tangled and so messy, like truly the only way to rid of it was to just walk away, destroy the whole thing, and just be honest about it. And like, it's this amazing scenario now. I'm going beyond your question, but like this scenario now is where like all I have to do is tell people my perception and interpretation of the moment, of the situation, and that's all I have to worry about. It is incredible to me reflecting back on, as odd as this sounds, all of my creative effort, all of my energy was being put behind the continuation of this lie and this facade. And the return that I've gotten with respect to like the energy and creativity that I have to point to other pursuits now that I'm just like being honest and telling the truth it's unimaginable based on where I was before.
Yeah, there's a reel or something I saw recently, and it spoke to me because, you know, we all work our 9-to-5 jobs, and we're millennials, so we've probably got our first iPhones midway through college.
Yep.
You know, before all the distraction and everything, like working now, like I find myself scrolling, like when I get bored on a call or like I'm doing something rote and monotonous. But this person was saying like the current generation doesn't understand the value of 8 hours of work, like what you can really get done in 8 hours of just dedicated work. And I think about that a lot because like if I go into my job and I do 8 hours of straight work, just hard work, I'm so far beyond most people.
Yeah.
But to that, the reason I'm saying this is to draw back to this whole point that you're talking about of like, you know, the amount of effort that you had to put into lying and manipulating. You now have that on the other end to do other pursuits.
Right.
And like, it's impossible to not see how much you're able to do now.
Right.
Like
yeah.
beyond, like you were already a smart guy. Like I said, like to get back to that point too, is like, I figured out you were full of shit when you got that job.
Yep.
And I didn't say anything, but like I began to question the aloofness. I'm like, no. This is not just like laziness or like, this is not a lazy guy. Like you don't just slip into laziness.
Right.
You know, you don't have an Xbox and Cheetos.
Right.
Like you're not a lazy guy.
Yep.
And so like, that was my first real seeding of like, there's probably something deeper going on here, but you continue to hide it so well.
Yeah.
And still hide behind that facade enough to where I couldn't poke or question.
Right.
That I had no idea. And like, it's hard for me to say, like, And I think a lot of people probably feel this way who have to deal with an alcoholic. It's like, people ask me, I'm like, I had no idea. I worked with you. I fellowshipped with you. I was a friend of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea. And I've honestly self-reflected. I'm like, what did I miss? And I'm talking about it now. It's like, I wish I could have done something. I wish I could have said something. I don't think it would have had any impact, like knowing your story, listening to your podcast. Like, I know it wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
But like personally, I'm like, man, like, how did that slip through the fucking cracks?
Right.
How?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say how because like it all boiled to a head so fast.
Right.
From my perspective.
Totally.
Because you had hidden it. You'd fought this for 10 years.
Yep.
And, for context, and when I really found out that something was wrong, I remember where I was at. I was on the highway, I-84, just past Glens Ferry on my way to Bozeman. So I was driving down. I was in a good mood. Mm-hmm. I was talking to friends, like my best friend Diogo had called me. We were chatting about work. This was exactly, for context for people and where I was at mentally. I had just lost my job.
Yep.
First time I'd ever been unemployed in my life. I kind of had this rose-colored glasses, like I'm gonna find a job quick.
It'll go quick.
Yeah. Spoiler alert: it took me 11 months and almost losing all our money in our houses. But nonetheless, I was a couple weeks into this thing and I was excited. I was starting to push for interviews. I was on my way to Bozeman to do the Mountain Tough podcast with Dustin and that crew, so I was excited to be there. And I was kind of taking calls with all my friends because one thing that I have always done is try to really keep in touch with my very close circle of friends. Mm-hmm. And see how people are doing. So I'd called a few people. They were checking in on me to see like how I was doing. Mm-hmm. And I got a call from you. And I don't know if you were under the influence of alcohol. And I don't know if you remember this conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's still one of the things that I personally regret. I was driving. I was getting close to Twin Falls. You called me. And you were crying. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of between tears. Like I could tell you were trying to compose yourself. And you said something to the effect of like, hey man, I've got a real problem. I'm really struggling. You were also very professional. You were like, no action from you. I'm like, all right. And so like, I come from this like kind of highs of talking to friends and then I get a call from you and it's, hey man, I am not doing good. I just wanted you to know I'm struggling. And I remember like I've had enough exposure to individuals who've struggled with different, mental health disorders. Mm-hmm. I remember the one thing I asked, like, are you suicidal? Mm-hmm. And you told me no, which was a lie. Mm-hmm. Fuck you. And I remember like, I asked you, I'm like, do I need to turn around? Mm-hmm. Like, I was prepared to turn around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you told me no, another lie. Mm-hmm. And I trusted you again. And I regret that. Yeah. Because I kept going. I was like, I don't know what I can do. He told me he's not suicidal. Like I have to take him at face value. Yep. But I think a lot of the collection of lies had probably led to a point where, it's like the boy who cried wolf. I'm like, okay, like I have to trust Kyle here. Like he's always bounced back. Like you said, you've always bounced back. Right. Like I guess this is another low, and maybe it's just the lowest that he's been in. Yep. Another aloof Kyle or something, and that had set me up to where I just kept going. Yep. And I really regret that, genuinely. Yeah. And I don't know what we can draw out of this for people who are dealing with alcoholics. I don't know if you really needed me there in that point, or if my turning around and coming back would have changed anything. Right. But I'll let you respond to that because that's a tough one. Yeah, no, and just thinking back to that time period, and ultimately one of the biggest takeaways and learnings and experiences going through rehab, like the thing that stands out to me with that call is I didn't even know how to express the need
for help. I didn't know how to articulate and be honest with what was going on. But it had finally hit a point where it was like, I need to do something. And Alyssa and I have talked about this a lot. In the end, I started taking a lot more risk to expose the lie because deep down I wanted to be done with it. But quite frankly, I was not man enough. I didn't have the courage enough to just say it. And so it's like I would expose myself more and more to these situations of risk of getting caught by those that were close enough to me that potentially would call me on it, or address it or bring it up. By that point that I had made the call, it's like my mental state was that I knew something had to radically change. In those last 2 days of me drinking, the only way that I've been able to like rationally communicate it or think about it is like I was fully prepared to allow alcohol to take my life. And there was a desire to end it, but there was also this last little bit of like clinging hope that held me back and was like desperate that things could change. And I don't have the language yet to like fully encapsulate that, but it's like that little bit of hope is what made me not take any more radical step. And it was truly just like this screw it mentality where it was like, if alcohol does me in, it does me in, and that's the way it's going to be, and that's the way it should be. And if it doesn't, like, I need freaking help and I need to do something different. And so like, yeah, it's interesting because I've talked about it on this podcast. It took me a few days of having to repeatedly say it in rehab that my name is Kyle, I'm an alcoholic, for the last part of that statement to not catch up in my throat. And so there was no way that I had the ability when you and I were talking for me to even utter those words, but there was a desire to have this like desperate cry out or connection with like, I'm not doing well. I need help. I need something. And that's really the chaos of the last 2 to 3 days of me drinking. And yeah,
it that led into the next 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And within 48 hours from that phone call, you were on your way to rehab. I think
Yep.
it was a Sunday morning.
Monday morning.
Okay.
Yep. Sunday was like kind of gathering my stuff. My parents came into town. I don't know that. I'm trying to remember. I honestly don't know that I talked to even anyone outside of my household on Sunday.
Yeah.
Maybe my sisters. But yeah, that would have been it.
Because was your brother-in-law in town?
He was in town up until Friday.
Okay. Because so I was going out of town. It must have been a Wednesday or Thursday when I was going down to Mountain Tough because I was unemployed.
Right. Yeah.
I could go
every
whenever I
day's
wanted.
a Saturday.
Yeah, every day's a Saturday. But I remember after that, like, again, I had some real reservations, and I remember calling my wife, and she was obviously very close with your wife in this whole time, and things were really like, again, several years of me just thinking I had an aloof friend, Kyle, who sometimes dropped the ball, to my a close friend, all of a sudden just completely unraveling.
Yep.
Like from the outside looking in, it was a supernova of explosion. Like it was so, it metastasized so quickly.
Yep.
It went from this like little benign tumor to the most like rip roaring cancer of every single, thing in your body.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I regret not turning around. Like that was, like I knew it was a cry for help, but I didn't know what it was for.
Right.
That
Yep.
was the hard part for me, is like somebody on the outside looking in, like in that point, you could have told me that you were doing heroin and it would have been just as much my guess as it would have been alcohol.
Right.
That's how well you hit it from me over the long term of
Right.
like, I would have never guessed that it was alcohol. I would have guessed maybe like you had started to allude to me that you had manic depression and that you struggled with mental health, which I know was kind of a big cover up for you.
Yep.
I didn't buy it, frankly, again, because I knew how smart you were. I'm like, this is bullshit. And I was like, well, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So like, you kind of probably, I would assume, not intentionally, you impeded yourself from help too. Like
100%.
All the years of lying, like I was ready and prepared to be there for you no matter what it was for. And you probably didn't understand or recognize that.
Right.
But at the same time, like I didn't know how to be there for you because I had no idea what was going on.
Yep.
It was just like this blind explosion in front of me. I'm like, okay, like I'm ready to triage.
Yep.
But I don't know what I'm triaging. Like, did your leg blow off? Like, hand? Like, tell me where it hurts, buddy. Like, I don't know.
Well, and that hits on a point that a lot of alcoholics get to, and a core part of their suffering is like, this becomes such an isolated battle for us and for me in particular. And it's like, I wanted so desperately to figure this out myself. And so the pursuit of self-knowledge with the goal of figuring out a solution of how to drink normally in my life. Never on how to just step away from alcohol. It was always how to drink normally in life. The pursuit of self-knowledge in that respect was really intense because I did want to do it alone. I didn't want to be a burden to other people. I didn't want to have to reach out. I didn't want to have to open up. I was so unpracticed in telling the truth and being honest that I didn't even know how to. And to your point about the supernova, it's like that stuff was building up and building pressure in me for years, right? And it did happen in like a catastrophic manner because it was like I had been holding back and trying to contain it and trying to do things myself for so long that the buildup that it had created just made it almost borderline like impossible not to explode. Like I've made the comment here on the podcast before, like I wish and I hope for anyone that's listening to this podcast that the manner in which, if you're telling a lie, if you feel like you're living a lie, the manner in which that you expose that lie is much more graceful than I did it. And I got lucky in the fact that I came out of it alive, first of all, but also able to right the ship and, you know, get connected and find like ultimately the solution. But it's one of those things like, I wouldn't change anything with my life or with my story, but if I had to sit down with someone who was faced with the same problem, it's just like select one person that you do feel like you can be honest with, and just it's going to be the most courageous and brave thing that you ever do, but just open up on a couch. Yeah. It is so much safer. You are going, if you are selective appropriately, and I think people have a lot more connections and friendships that are understanding and willing to listen than they realize. Like, you can do this. You don't have to have the supernova effect. Like, you can start letting things escape, and like you can do this in a much more controlled and mild manner, but ultimately don't ever think that you can get away with the lie. That's going to just continue to build up and lead to a disaster and lead to a point where your life is completely unmanageable. And your life can be unmanageable, and you can gracefully set yourself on the path to recovery, or your life can be unmanageable and you can supernova this.
And the supernova was rough.
Yes.
I was, and it's rough for me and my wife.
Exactly. Yeah, it impacts other people too.
And I know like your family was coming in, like,
Yep.
it hit this critical mass where people were like, Kyle's not okay. And I think Kyle's got to look for a charger.
Yep.
Is that what you're looking for?
We're losing charge.
And so like the Supernova, right? Like those 48 hours after you called me crying and I made the decision to not turn around. Again, I'm going to keep saying that I regret it as an individual to not do that. Though I don't think it would have had much of an impact on your pursuit afterwards.
No.
It was interesting because I called my wife right afterwards and I was like, man, like, do I need to turn around? Like I asked her and she's like, I don't know. Like we were well hidden from it. I think Allie might have actually had a little bit more. Allie's my wife for those listening. She had a relationship with your wife, Alyssa. Mm-hmm. And it'd be interesting to get, honestly, like if you ever want more detail on this, like to talk to my wife, cause like I'm blind on this, but I know she and Alyssa were talking and, so I kind of got it from the other end, right? Yep. Like I was kind of going to my wife who was talking to your wife and she's like, yeah, there's something wrong. Like, Kyle's really struggling with like his mental health or whatever lie you'd been telling Alyssa or that you guys had concocted about like, your psychosis. I don't know what the right word is or whatever it was. But, I was like, I'm worried. And I think I might be wrong here, so you need to fact check me, but I don't know if it was Alyssa who was worried about you literally dying, killing yourself, and she had told Allie that. But between my asking you if you were going to kill yourself and you telling me no, the signs that came the next few days of like text messages and I'm not wells to me getting it secondhand through my wife that, Alyssa was up late and found you like whether it's comatose or whatever you were in, whatever state you were in, saying that you were going to go to the hospital. Like at one point I know my wife was prepared to go over to your house to help Alyssa with your body. And I don't think it was like said in those terms. Right. But I remember talking like on my way back from Bozeman to my wife and she's like, I'm kind of on standby if Alyssa calls me. Cause Alyssa, I think had asked if she could bring Grant over to our house to be watched if we needed. And of course we said yes. But at that point, I remember being a little selfish in that point and telling my wife, I'm like, don't go over there.
For her own safety.
For her own safety.
Totally.
Not because I had thought that you were capable of doing harm, but like I've had to be exposed to dead bodies, like through EMS, through all this other stuff. And like, I did not want her to have to go over and, flop your dead body over like in a pile of puke. Right. Which is what I was starting to concoct in my head very quickly. Like, if you're going to kill yourself, like, and this is dark, like, I did not want my wife to come in on you face down with puke or with your brain splattered across the ceiling. And I didn't know what you were capable of in like a taking of your life scenario. And it scared me for my wife more than you, to be frank. Like at that point, like where it had built to was I was convinced you were in a very short time. And I told my wife that like, don't do it. Don't go over there. And she was adamant because my wife's also like very stoic and she's like, I think she was kind of like, fuck you, Zach. Like, I'm going to do what I want to do. Like, I'm going to go help my friend. And honestly, I was pissed off at you in that moment because you were putting me in a tough spot. Not because, selfishly, like, of course I didn't want you to take my life, but now it's like, oh, my wife's involved too. And frankly, like, just like with you and anybody else, like our families come first. And I started to get defensive. And I don't know if my wife picked up on this or Alyssa or anybody, but like I was starting to get adamant, like just wait for me to get there. Like I want, like if I had to walk in on you dying, I wanted it to be me.
There's two thoughts or things that hearing all that makes me reflect back on and think about. One of them ties back to the complexity and the web of lies that gets started. So like not only it just paints the picture of not only am I crafting these lies across the relationships in my life, but my wife is also having to cover up. Now she didn't know until the end, like the very ultimate root cause and true reason, but there was still Kyle is not well. Kyle is unstable and Kyle is inconsistent. And there were a web of lies that she had to craft and a protective wall that she had to put up in her relationships and her life, that at the end of all this, as we were really hitting this point of complete chaos and unmanageability, that all started to crumble. And then as you portrayed, it's like her friendships and her relationships are starting to get involved. And the second thing, and I did kind of ready the Kleenex for this, just a heads up, because I haven't talked about this at all. And really the only time I reflected back on it, I went back and looked through some stuff from Rehab. It did cause quite a swell of emotions, but one of the activities we did within the first 3 to 4 days in rehab, it's a pretty classic like practice or technique. It is writing out the story, and the way we did it was writing your obituary for the scenario where your drug of choice takes your life, and then for the scenario where you get back and get on the road of recovery. And I was actually at some point planning on doing a dive into like the meaningful activities that we did in rehab, but this one in particular, the story that I wrote out for the situation where alcohol took my life, there are two significant aspects of it that stand out. One is the picture that you just painted of not wanting your wife to come and discover a body, just call it in a messy state. I detailed that with my then 2-year-old son. And the thought at the time, like one of the greatest joys and connections that I had with Grant was he was way into animal noises. And his particular favorite that I could pull off really well was making an elephant noise. And he would come up to me just randomly at this time, and he would go, "Daddy, Daddy, Ellie, Ellie, Ellie." Like he wouldn't say the full word. He would just get so excited and just start saying, like he would shake me. He'd be like, "Ellie, Ellie, Ellie," until I, did the elephant noise, made a big sweeping motion with my hand for like a trunk. And the way I thought it out and wrote about it in the obituary exercise was I was discovered by my son who was found shaking me, just going, "Daddy Ellie, Daddy Ellie." And I was just asphyxiated in my own vomit. And that it's really interesting looking back at the actual piece of paper that I wrote this on, because you can see in my writing my hands start shaking. There's dried tears on the page, and I just had this breakdown around this idea that he could have been the one to discover me. had that situation played out, the other aspect of my obituary for that scenario was that not only did I leave behind a wife and a son, but I also left behind an unborn child. At the time that I wrote that letter and did that exercise, I did not know Alyssa was pregnant with Lucy. Deep down, it was a desire that, like, the previous month's attempt had worked. And so in thinking through that worst case scenario, if things had happened that way at that time, I truly connected with the idea that, like, I had this son that loved me and looked up to me and cherished this thing and this connection that I had with him. And on top of that, having a growing family coming along, and just obviously little did I know how everything was going to play out. But yeah, I mean, like I said, this is an activity. This is like a like extremely meaningful exercise for me to do, because in all honesty, like, there is still some level of fear driven energy behind all of this, because I'll work like hell to avoid that scenario. My life has grown and been driven by so much meaning and purpose that is ultimately comes down to who I show up to be for Grant, who I show up to be for Alyssa, and who I was during Lucy's life. Like, those are just so fundamental to me right now. The idea of putting them through, that scenario is just unfathomable at this point. Kleenex got busted out, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, it's hearing that, right? Like, as a non-alcoholic, as someone who has never struggled with suicidal thoughts, someone who's never struggled with alcohol or a substance, it's hard to hear. Like, I think everybody, maybe naturally, or maybe I'm just dark. Like, I think about scenarios where that happens accidentally to me, right?
Yep.
And like, I fall and hit my head and my daughter finds me. Like, you go through those things and you think about, man, like, those are things that you don't want to ever have happen. And I think everybody has those inherent fears, and those must just be completely 1000x'd for somebody in a situation like yours.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading a book recently, just finished it, and The Game of Life and How to Play It. It was written like 1909 by a lady, but it's kind of biblically based. I say biblically based because she does reference the Bible throughout it. But her whole idea is like that intentionality and, that thought. And you said, like, there's a lot of stuff driven from fear.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, I have found myself driven from fear a lot, like completely separate scenarios. What's on the line is way less, but like even my unemployment and the fear of not being able to provide for my family. Like,
yeah.
But in this book, one of the things that I'm taking away is I have recently been driven in a lot more of fear versus driven from a perspective of hope and reliance on God to always provide.
Mm-hmm.
We went through our own personal exercise, my wife and I, through that 11 months of almost losing everything, where we did turn everything over to God. And I guess my question to you here in this scenario is, like, how much of your recovery, like, coming out of that, like we just talked about that supernova. I just talked about how I had to protect my own family from you in that scenario. And you came out the other side. It's been amazing. Like, we probably need 6 more hours on this podcast because you got a couple months out, we started to reconnect. We started to go through like little bits and bobs, found out you were pregnant, and there's something about tailgates with us. I don't know if we need to like stop being around like trucks and tailgates, like when I picked you up from rehab, but then we were at a men's group on a Friday morning, and I remember it, and you said, hey, can you meet me there early? So of course, I don't know what our thread is with just being up at ass crack of dawn, but I met you there early, and you told me about Lucy. The first little bit you knew, which turned out to be not at all what it was.
Correct.
It was something bad,
but they knew there was a health concern.
Yeah.
And actually, it being a Friday men's group, it was only hours afterwards that Alyssa and I were unexpectedly back at the hospital and thinking that we were going to lose her that day.
And I don't think we have probably enough time in the day to go through all of that. But like I we're talking about like basing stuff off of fear. And my point before this was like, I have found myself doing that, but I've found too through being dedicated to reading the Bible this last year, being dedicated to reading more scripture and being more faith-based. And you and I have a very similar path, a very similar view on religion, and relate a lot on that. But like, at what point did you start to turn it over to something bigger? Was that also in rehab? Because like, I'm struggling with that now continually every day of like, how do I not be fear-based, but understand there's something bigger out there that has a better, whether you call it predefined destiny for me. When you think about like suicide, when you think about like what it could have been, when you think about never getting to that point again, like, was that in rehab? Was it prior to rehab? Was it after rehab?
Yeah. So it was very specifically August 8th, like 8:45 to 9 a.m. And that was when we found out about Lucy's health concern. But I actually want to step it back because what rehab provided me was the opportunity to level and be honest with myself that I wasn't even open to the idea of reconnecting with God, reconnecting with a higher power, and of turning things over to Him in scenarios that were out of my control. So like the way that played out in rehab was to set this all up. I went into rehab and I promised myself I was going to believe everything that they told me, and I was going to assume everything that they were having us doing was in our best interest. It took me about 5 to 7 days to realize I was adhering to that promise, except for AA activities and stemming from AA, the discussion and the thoughts around a higher power or a God. I can't remember what made me realize that I was still pushing back on that, but there was a moment where I said, okay, I'm going to be open to this. I'm not forcing myself to believe it, but I'm going to be open to the fact that maybe there's something here. That day, we went to an AA meeting, and there was an old gentleman that had a share. To this date, it's like the shortest share that I've ever experienced in AA. But this man simply stated, I do not want a God that I can understand. And I literally sat there and just thought about that the rest of the meeting, the rest of the night, into the next day. And it just made me realize, like, I do have an incredible capacity and drive for knowledge that has been detrimental to me when it comes down to just accepting things and turning things over, because I have continually been able to achieve and do things on my own, which is great. Like I'm so grateful for that capability, but it was detrimental to me in the instance that like it drove me to seek self-knowledge to solve my problem with alcohol, when my problem with alcohol required me to accept the way that I am and that I am an alcoholic, and to just like turn that over to God and like stop worrying about it and then stop obsessing about trying to do it normally. That was like that first step to like, hey, why if if there is like something higher, something more powerful than me, and it would only take me a nanosecond to prove out that in this world there's something that is greater than me and more powerful than me, it's sitting on the same couch as me. It's like, Zach has, what do I have, like 30 or 40 pounds on you?
Close to it.
And you will continually, 100% of the time, destroy me on the mats. It's like right there and then is an instance that there's a higher power that exists in the world than me. Okay. Now expand that idea out and just like grow it in magnitude across all the aspects of your life. And it was a very humbling like exercise to go through, because all of a sudden I realized it's like, no, there is something greater than the power and the capabilities that I have out there. So what's to say that there's not like an extraordinary and undescribable step beyond even all the human capabilities? And that's when I finally started being like, all right, I'm open and willing to like bring in this concept of a higher power. And again, tying back to that stage of innocence that Alyssa and I were in after I left rehab and before we found out about Lucy. During that time period, I said that I was connected with a higher power. I believed in a higher power. I was starting to talk about it in terms of God and using like the singular form of it as it's like well known in Western religions. But there was not a real relationship and a real connection until I found out about Lucy, because quite literally what happened in the doctor's office that day was a disconnect with my physical body. And I actually described this in one of the podcasts, and it was the first time I said it this way, but it's actually the best way I've had of recreating or describing what actually happened. The first thing I thought of when I heard about Lucy was, this is God paying you back for 12 years of lying, for all the crap that you put your family and your friends through, for all the crap you subjected yourself to. But this is punishment. This is God punishing you. This is this like spiteful God that you hear about, you know, especially in the camp of people who are like against religion. It's like, why would a God be, you know, that kind of thought pattern popped up into my head. And again, I am like detached from my body at this point. And it's like, I could see, not truly see, but like in letter form, but I could see that idea and that thought in front of me. And I had this moment where I literally destroyed it. Like I saw it crumble before me, and I was able to dismantle it and replace it with Lucy was always part of the plan. God always knew that things had to happen this way. I had to have so many years of intense suffering and struggle to like, it was a grind. Like it sounds weird, but like I figured out how to freaking work hard during those periods of, or during those years of alcoholism, because like what Zach was talking about, I was always able to make up for things and bounce back. Like, I mean, if alcoholism taught me one thing, it was how to just, when you were in the right mental state, to just put your nose to the grinder and just go hard. And like, I got those lessons from battling alcoholism. I also got the lessons of like of being honest and not thinking you had to do everything yourself. And then having the intense moments of self-reflection and opening up the potential for the relationship for God. And then having that moment with Lucy, finding out about Lucy and being able to literally destroy and then replace these thought patterns and perspective. And another way to describe it is like, it almost felt like God got a little bit sick of me poking and prodding, and threw the curtain back and said, look at this. I have a plan. I've got this. Go back to doing your thing. And from that point forward, it has just been this incredible trust and connection that it's like I know it's the wrong thing to visualize, but like I can visualize that old man with a beard standing by this like red curtain, and he threw it back, and there's this table, and it's like there was his plan laid out on that table. That's all I needed to see. And it has just been, it's been an incredible shift from that moment. I think adrenaline, fear, and momentum drove me to not have any alcoholic cravings from the time I left rehab, really from the time I checked into rehab until that moment with Lucy. It has been my unwavering belief and trust in God and his plan that has like just sustained me from that moment forward till now. But with all the ups and downs that we've experienced, it's like I can literally visualize the crumbling of that old mentality and thought pattern and the replacement of the new one. And again, I can see God like opening the curtain to me. So yeah, gosh, it was just incredible.
It's and I think birds of a feather flock together kind of thing. Like even despite your alcoholism, like your friend group says a lot, right? Like
yes,
if you're top performers, and I can unabashedly say I've always been a top performer.
Yep.
Like
absolutely.
Like I push just the same way you do. And again, that's what's attracted to people. Like if I want to write a book, I'm going to write a book. If I want to do this, I'm going to do this. Like it's always been that way. And I liked what you said because I have fought that for my whole life, which is the seeking self-knowledge.
Yes.
I can always do it myself. Like I grew up in a religious household, but I always kind of push back. I'm like, I can do it myself.
Yep.
Always questioning, right? You
Yep.
grow up in like that kind of science, engineering, like hypothesis driven world. Like
right.
I always thought it was healthy to question. So I traveled all over the world. I studied Buddhism. I studied Islam in Saudi Arabia. Like I'm like, I always felt like I was smart enough to know that I never had all the answers.
Yep.
But I wanted to seek them. I'm like, I could probably figure out the answers.
Yep.
And what's interesting to me in just this brief part of this conversation is what it takes to get somebody to give their life up to God. Because you and I have kind of done it at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like we've always been there. I always call myself a Christian.
Yep.
I always do that. But it's interesting what it takes.
Yes.
Like for you, it was Lucy, which is like the ultimate like loss.
Yep.
But this is almost embarrassing for me to say. Like I remember, this is going to be real brief, but I know you know the story. So like May of 2022, my wife was 7 or 8 months pregnant with our second kid, and she almost died.
Yep.
In front of my eyes.
Yeah.
Like, just real brief. Like we live out in the middle of nowhere in Atlanta, Idaho. Midday walk. My wife and I decide to take a break from work, walk out close to our cabin.
Springtime ice on the
No ice.
road.
No, it was melted.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, it was melted. There was snow on the ground, but it was melted, and we were walking on our road, and our big 130-pound dog got the zoomies.
Yeah, that's right.
And my wife was 50 yards in front of me. I was staring at her. Dog takes off after her, not after her, but takes off towards her. I make the mistake of saying, "Hey, Allie, watch out!" And she turned right into the dog, and her feet went out from under her with her big belly, and it was slow motion for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear her head hit a rock, and it sounded like a .22 rifle went off, and her body was limp. Ran over there, blood pooling behind her head like a movie.
Mm-hmm.
I do everything terribly wrong. Like I lift up her head trying to like say,
right.
She probably could have broken her neck and I would have made it worse. But I was like, Allie, and she was unresponsive. And in that moment, I'm like, she's dead.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in that split second before I ran back to the cabin to get our fire radio to call in a life flight helicopter, I was like, God, if you bring her and we didn't know what gender it was. Like if you bring my wife and my child through this, I will do anything. I will serve you. I said all the things.
Yeah.
And it hurts my heart to say that turned out to be a lie.
Mm-hmm.
It was a self-serving thing in that moment, like where my wife was dead in front of me, and I was so desperate that I reached out.
Yep.
And the fucked up things, I didn't follow through on it.
Yep.
So long story short, she survived. A lot of staples in her head. Our son came out. I mean, he's a little weird, but yeah,
he's top heavy too.
He's top
he tips
heavy.
Over all the
he
time.
He does. But it came out, and what's silly is my wife. God knows what you need to get you through it. Unfortunately for you, it was 10 to 12 years of alcoholism, lies, and ultimately the birth and death of your daughter to get you there. For me, it was a lifetime of all this stuff, and it wasn't my wife dying in front of me.
Right.
It was late. I followed that path for a little while, like I always did.
Right.
Yep. I'm gonna read my Bible. I'm gonna do these things.
Momentum and
it slid back.
Yep.
And I was just like back to like I think I can figure this out.
Yeah.
And for me, it took like 11 months of unemployment and like just being so raw and realizing that I can't provide. Like it hit that provider piece of me to really get me over the edge, to have that like full like, oh, like I don't control this.
Yeah.
This is all hevel. For those who want to look that up, in the Bible, and I think Leviticus, but like ultimately nothing matters because God is in control. And if you have to give that up to him in order to open yourself up to what he has planned for you. And I'm still early on my journey, to be frank, but like it took a different path.
Yeah.
But it's embarrassing because I'm sure there were moments along your alcoholism where you were probably so close to the edge. You probably made a self-promise to you and to God, reached out, and then didn't follow through. And it's so embarrassing, even as a non-alcoholic, to say like, my wife died in front of me. I made that promise.
Right.
And that wasn't enough.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting with regards to alcoholism and finding the solution, which ultimately is a real relationship, a real personal relationship with God. The language that is used in the literature is for these spiritual experiences or mystical experiences is being rocketed into a fourth dimension. They truly talk about it using those terms. And I recently reread that and was just like, this doesn't jive with the rest of this book, written in the mid to late 1930s. But it is, without a doubt, the only way that I can describe what I went through and what I've heard a lot of other alcoholics go through that find the solution. The interesting point, and as it pertains to like your journey and story to a relationship with God, is like that rocketing into a fourth dimension doesn't have to happen in an extreme moment, like finding out that your daughter's life is at risk. It's like my sponsor discovered it doing the dishes. And the aspect of those situations that are very similar is the outcome, but also more importantly, the prerequisites that lead up to those moments. And it's interesting hearing your story, and also the fact that like you're almost asking for forgiveness for it, which is like not necessary at all. And this is something I talk to people struggling with, especially after going through the loss of Lucy. They're like, well, my problems aren't as big as your problems. And I'm embarrassed to say it. It's like, but hold on, like this is your life and these are your problems. Don't downplay them. Everyone is suffering. And so like, don't make excuses, like just own it a little bit and just like accept that that's where you're at in life. But anyway, back to like these reconnections and establishing a personal relationship with God. The prerequisites are really clear and really apparent once you get through it. And it's this acronym that is utilized in recovery. And there's a word for this where it's like the thing is actually the description for what it is. I don't know what that word is, but the acronym is HOW. And so the way it's framed is people are always like, well, how do I enter recovery? How do I get a relationship with God? Well, the HOW stands for honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And so you have to be honest about yourself, about your current situation. And this can be drawn and played out with me as an alcoholic, with you desiring more of a relationship with God. It's like you're honest about it. What you just did was the honesty aspect of it. You also indicated open-mindedness, where it's like I had been doing all this self-knowledge seeking. That wasn't working. And so the open-mindedness aspect in that regard, or in my regard with alcoholism, is like, hey, the things I'm doing aren't working. Maybe there's another way. And then the willingness aspect is really just, it's kind of balancing like a drive to, let's go back to the connection with in relationship with God. It's balancing the aspect of like, I have a willingness to have a connection with God, but almost also being like, you kind of need some patience for it to happen. And our stories are really interesting because mine was a slow progression with a very distinct and catastrophic shift. Your story might be more like that slow progression where if you took a pause and had a moment of reflection, you would go, holy cow, like I've actually had that profound shift without really maybe like that distinct one moment or that like rocketing, like it wasn't just like a impulse rocket blast off. It was like a slow burn, but like the change that has occurred is real and meaningful. And so it's what I tell people about. It's about how you prepare yourself with that honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And then it's like, if you do those things and do those things genuinely, it's like that moment's going to happen. And like, you've done your part.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Always.
Oh, man. Well, I have to pee. So it's probably a good time.
We've ran long, yeah.
Yeah, which is good. And I think we could go longer.
I know, yeah. We'll have to think of a follow-up here.
Part 2.
Yeah.
But I had thought a little bit about it, and you can edit it out or not if you want to. But like, I was thinking long and hard about what we went through just from our relationship with your alcoholism, especially towards the end when we talked about that catastrophic end. Like, all I can say is like, I hope I'm not an anomaly, and I don't think I am, from the perspective that I think people out there struggling with alcohol probably have friends that are like myself.
Yes.
And you can't go back and change it, and I don't know if it would have changed it, but I was always there and ready to listen and to not judge. And, you know, I'm a guy. Like, I would want to help to find a solution.
Yep.
Maybe that would not have been what you wanted in that time if
Right.
it would have just been for me to sit on a couch with you and do nothing.
Yes.
But there are people out there who don't carry judgment. There are people out there who are ready to love you. There are people out there ready to help you through it, and want to. And you can correct me and tell me if, you know, you got to go through it on your own. I don't know, but I was there, and that's all I got.
I think I actually wanted, when you said it, I wanted to wrap this up and circle back to what you thought about and decided on your drive from your cabin to pick me up at rehab, because the point that I want to end on is, as competent, as capable, and as strong as you are, you could never accept on my behalf my alcoholism. You could never convince me, you could never push me to accept my alcoholism. The responsibility of being honest and accepting your situation and accepting yourself as an alcoholic is entirely on the alcoholic. As soon as that step is taken, the love and the support that can be there is the driving force that will sustain that. So what you said and the way you approached our drive home was perfect. And so I want to allow you just to say there were 3 things, right? No judgment. Let me talk about whatever, in whatever manner, and just listen. There is no better way to support someone that is struggling in your life. You can never do the work for them. You can never accept it for them. But if you approach it with those 3 things, the possibility of recovery becomes a reality.
And patience, because this is
Patience.
how many months after that we're actually finally having this conversation that I'd love to have had in that car, but
absolutely
put off.
Absolutely. No, that's perfect. And a perfect point, because the other thing with regards to entering recovery is like every single relationship that you have in life is muddled, messed up. And Zach's point earlier about meeting me after recovery, after rehab, you're starting anew. There's hurt that's going to exist. There's pain. There's things that you will have to dive into in the past, but nothing will be solved in one session. That's absolutely right. And as the alcoholic, you just have to be committed to time. To nothing is going to better a relationship more than just consistent effort and consistently showing up. That was special. Thank you for doing this.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I wish we could keep going longer, but I don't know if the computer will allow us to.
No, we obviously love you all very much. I love you deeply as a friend. Our paths were meant to cross. Like, as silly as it sounds, if someone else would have jumped on that trigger, you were headed up to the cabin to live there. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know how much our paths would have crossed beyond that. But when we were moving the trigger over from your place, it's like we really connected, talked. You invited us up to the cabin. We took you up on it, and things went from there. So it's like our friendship and the love that exists here is all part of a plan.
It is. Well, we love you guys, and we're so glad to see you guys where you're at.
Thank you. All right. Take care, all. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others or give us a rating on your channel of choice. My hope is that my story can help others in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life that they feel could be bettered. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. I cannot solve your problems for you, but I can listen. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and life is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you have to endure. Until next time.